Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about Henry VIII, one of the most infamous kings in all of history, a guy who literally changed the entire course of England just because he wanted a divorce. Trust me, by the time we're done, you're going to be real thankful you didn't live in Tudor England. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Alright, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to Tudor England in the early 1500s and trust me, you're going to be grateful for that mattress by the time we're done. So congratulations, you just woke up in Tudor England, it's 1509, and the 17-year-old Henry VIII has just become king. The air smells like wood smoke and unwashed bodies. The streets are narrow, crowded, and covered in a layer of mud, animal waste, and who knows what else. If you're in London, the Thames River reeks because it's basically an open sewer. Hygiene isn't exactly a priority yet. Good news. Henry is young, athletic, handsome, and everyone is excited about him. Bad news. He's got a temper that would make a modern rage quitter look chill. Picture this. Henry is tall, like really tall for the time, over 6 feet, with reddish gold hair, a square jaw, and an athletic build from all the hunting, jousting, and tennis he plays. He's basically the CrossFit guy of Tudor England, always showing off how many physical activities he excels at. When he walks into a room, you feel it. The guy has presence. He's also wicked smart, speaks multiple languages, and plays several musical instruments. Right now, Henry's married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who was actually first married to his older brother Arthur. Yeah, awkward. Arthur died after just a few months of marriage, and eventually Henry married Catherine to keep the alliance with Spain. She's about 6 years older than him, super religious and extremely well educated, the kind of woman who can hold her own in any conversation. Now, here's the thing about being king in 1509. You don't just rule the country, you are the country. There's no separation between the personal and the political. If Henry's happy, England's happy. If Henry's pissed off, everyone better watch out. You know how some people today have to worry about their boss seeing their social media posts? Multiply that by 1,000. Imagine your boss could literally have you executed if you said the wrong thing. That's Henry. When he first became king, Henry spent money like there was no tomorrow. His dad, Henry VII, had been crazy frugal, squirreling away a fortune. Young Henry blew through that inheritance like a lottery winner on a bender. Fancy clothes covered in jewels? Check. Elaborate feasts that would feed a modern town for a month? Check. Palaces and renovations? Double check. The cold stones under your feet in the palace would be covered with luxurious woven rushes, think of them as Tudor carpets, and changed regularly in Henry's quarters because he was obsessed with cleanliness. Well, relative cleanliness. You'd still smell body odour everywhere because people believed that bathing too often was dangerous. They thought water could enter the body through pores and make you sick. So, instead, they'd change the linen underwear they wore beneath their clothes, believing that the linen would absorb dirt and sweat from the body. When you walked through a Tudor palace, your senses would be overwhelmed. Tapestries covered the walls, not just for decoration, but to keep out drafts in those cold stone buildings. Henry had over 2,000 of them. The walls would be painted with bright colours and gilded details that would catch the light from candles and fireplaces. And speaking of light, it was precious. Candles were expensive, so most places would be dim by our standards, creating this mysterious, flickering atmosphere where shadows dance on the walls. The smell of wood fires would mix with the scent of herbs strewn on the floor, the tang of sweat and the aromas of cooking food. Meals were a serious business, with course after course of meats and sweets for the nobility. If you were lucky enough to eat at court, You might get some of the 1,240 oxen, 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, 760 calves, 1,870 pigs, and 53 wild boar that were consumed in just 1 year of Henry's reign, and we haven't even counted the birds yet. But you wouldn't be eating at court, would you? You'd be one of the common folk, and your diet would be a lot simpler. Bread, pottage, a thick soup, maybe some cheese, seasonal vegetables, and occasional meat if you were lucky. Your teeth would ache constantly from the coarse bread full of bits of millstone that wore down your enamel. Your back would hurt from working dawn to dusk. Your clothes would be scratchy wool that never quite dried in the damp English weather. In those early years, Henry was busy making his mark. He got into European politics, making alliances and breaking them as it suited him. In 1511, he joined the Holy League against France, because everyone was always fighting France back then. It was like the national pastime. In 1513, he led an army across the Channel and captured a couple of towns. He was all proud of himself, strutting around like he was the new Henry V or something. That same year, 1513, the Scots decided it would be a good time to invade England while Henry was away in France. Bad call. Henry's wife Catherine, who was serving as regent while he was gone, organised the defence. The English forces crushed the Scottish army at the Battle of Flodden, killing the Scottish king James IV and about 10,000 Scottish soldiers. Catherine sent Henry the blood-stained coat of the Scottish king as a trophy. Not exactly your typical souvenir, but it made her point. You might be wondering what life was like for regular people during this time. Well, it was no picnic. The average life expectancy was about 35 years, though that's a bit misleading since infant mortality was so high. If you made it to adulthood, you might live into your 50s or 60s, but daily life was hard. If you were a peasant, you'd live in a small house made of wattle and daub, basically a wooden frame filled in with a mixture of mud, clay, straw and animal dung. Your roof would be thatch, which kept out rain but also made a cosy home for mice, rats and insects that would occasionally fall on you while you slept. Several generations of your family would live together in 1 or 2 rooms, along with any livestock you might own during the winter months. Privacy wasn't really a thing. Your day would start before dawn. If you were a man, you'd head out to the fields. If you were a woman, you'd be responsible for the house, the children, the vegetable garden, preserving food, making clothes, and often helping with farm work too. Children as young as 6 or 7 would be working alongside the adults, learning the skills they'd need. The rhythm of your life would follow the seasons and the church calendar, planting in spring, harvesting in fall, and trying to survive the winter. Church holidays would break up the monotony with feasts and celebrations, though even those were affected by whether it was a lean year or a good harvest. Speaking of the church, it was everywhere in Tudor life. The Catholic Church controlled education, provided what little healthcare existed, and was the centre of community life. Monasteries dotted the countryside, and the church owned about a quarter of all the land in England. The church was also your social security system. If you were old, sick, or fell on hard times, the church was where you'd go for help. You'd go to church every Sunday and on holy days, which were frequent, and you'd pay tithes, basically a 10% tax, to the church. Most people couldn't read, so they learned Bible stories from stained glass windows, wall paintings, and the priest's sermons. Religion wasn't just something you did on Sundays. It was woven into every aspect of life, from the prayers you said throughout the day to the saints you appealed to for help with specific problems. Now, back to Henry. In the early years of his reign, he relied heavily on advisors like Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who rose from humble beginnings to become Lord Chancellor, essentially the king's right-hand man. Wolsey was ambitious, clever, and effective. He did the hard work of governance while Henry enjoyed the fun parts of being king: the hunting, the feasting, the showing off. In 1518, Henry and Wolsey arranged a major diplomatic treaty called the Treaty of London, where all the major European powers agreed to peace. It was a big deal, even if it didn't last very long. Henry liked to present himself as a Renaissance prince, cultured, educated, and sophisticated, as well as a warrior king. These were also the years when Henry was desperately trying to have a son with Catherine. She got pregnant multiple times, but most of the pregnancies ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. Their only surviving child was a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. Henry doted on little Mary at first, showing her off to visitors and carrying her around proudly. But as the years went by and no son appeared, he grew increasingly worried. You have to understand, for a king, having a male heir wasn't just a personal desire, it was a political necessity. The memory of the Wars of the Roses, when England was torn apart by rival claimants to the throne, was still fresh. Henry's own father had won the crown in battle. Without a clear male heir, the fear was that England would descend into civil war again after Henry's death. Henry did have an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, born in 1519 to his mistress Elizabeth Bessie Blount. Fitzroy literally means son of the king. Subtle, right? Henry acknowledged the boy and gave him titles, making him Duke of Richmond and Somerset. In those days, having mistresses was expected for a king, and no one thought much of it as long as it didn't interfere with the serious business of producing legitimate heirs. Meanwhile, Henry was developing a reputation as a defender of the Catholic faith. In 1521, he wrote a book attacking Martin Luther's ideas. The Pope was so pleased that he gave Henry the title Defender of the Faith, a title that British monarchs still use today, ironically enough, considering what happened later. By the mid-1520s, Henry was getting seriously worried about the succession. Catherine was in her 40s by this point, and it seemed unlikely she would have more children. Henry started to convince himself that his lack of a son was divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. He pointed to a passage in Leviticus that said such a marriage was sinful. Convenient how he only remembered this after 15+ years of marriage, right? Around this time, Henry became infatuated with Anne Boleyn, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Anne was smart, witty, sophisticated, and had spent time at the French court, which made her seem exotic and interesting. Unlike her sister Mary, who had briefly been Henry's mistress years earlier, Anne refused to sleep with Henry unless he married her. She played hard to get, which just made Henry more determined to have her. Now, let's pause and think about what it would be like to be Catherine during these years. You've left your home country to marry into a foreign royal family. Your first husband died. You waited years in limbo before finally marrying his brother. You've endured multiple pregnancies, most ending in heartbreak. You've done everything expected of a queen. You've been diplomatic, religious, generous to the poor, supportive of your husband. And now, after all that, your husband is publicly pursuing another woman and trying to set you aside. Catherine was not going quietly. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, which meant there was no sin in marrying Henry. She appealed to her nephew, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, for help, and Charles put pressure on Pope Clement VII not to grant Henry an annulment. The Pope was in a tough spot. On one hand, he didn't want to anger Henry. On the other, Charles V's troops had recently sacked Rome, so the Pope was basically under the Emperor's control. He stalled, hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself. Henry grew increasingly frustrated with the delays. He sent ambassadors to argue his case at Rome. He consulted with theologians who might support his position. He pressured Catherine to enter a convent, which would have ended the marriage. She refused. While this drama was unfolding, life at court became increasingly tense. People had to choose sides. Were they with the king or the queen? Catherine maintained her dignity throughout, still performing her royal duties and still insisting she was Henry's true wife. Anne Boleyn was becoming more influential with her own faction of supporters. In 1529, Cardinal Wolsey failed to secure the annulment Henry wanted, and he fell from power. Thomas Cromwell, another clever commoner who had risen through ability rather than birth, began to take Wolsey's place as Henry's chief advisor, and Cromwell had some radical ideas about how to solve the king's great matter, as the marriage issue was called. The cold winter wind whips against the walls of the palace as you huddle closer to the fire. You can feel the tension in the air, thick as the smoke from the hearth. Servants whisper in corners. Nobles watch each other carefully, measuring loyalties, calculating risks. Outside, the common folk go about their business, mostly unaware that their king's marriage problems are about to change the course of their country's history. The fire crackles and sends shadows dancing across the room. Your eyelids grow heavy as you imagine yourself there, in that world so different from our own. The smell of smoke fills your nostrils, the sound of distant voices fades, and you drift deeper into the story of Henry VIII, England's most infamous king. As the flames in the hearth slowly die down to glowing embers, you sink deeper into your comfortable position. Your breathing slows, matching the gentle rhythm of the night. You feel your muscles relaxing one by one, from your toes all the way up to your shoulders. The weight of the day melts away as you float in that pleasant space between wakefulness and dreams, waiting to hear what happens next in the story of a king whose personal desires would reshape a nation. Your body feels heavy with the weight of sleep beginning to settle in, but the story of Henry and his quest for a new wife is just getting started. The embers in your mind's hearth still glow with the image of a king growing increasingly desperate for a solution to his great matter. By 1530, Henry was done waiting for the Pope to give him what he wanted. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's new right-hand man, had a radical idea. What if England just stopped recognising the Pope's authority? Wild, right, but Henry was frustrated enough to consider it. Cromwell was a fascinating guy, the Tudor equivalent of that friend who grew up with nothing but somehow always has a hustle going. He'd been born to a blacksmith, travelled around Europe as a young man, taught himself law and worked his way up through sheer cleverness. Henry recognised talent when he saw it, and Cromwell had talent in spades. Together, Henry and Cromwell began to chip away at the church's power in England. They started by charging the entire clergy with violating an obscure medieval law called praemunire, which basically meant recognising foreign authority, the Pope, over the king. The clergy had to pay a massive fine and recognise Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England and clergy, though they added the face-saving phrase, "as far as the law of Christ allows." In January 1533, Henry couldn't wait any longer. Anne Boleyn was pregnant, and he needed to marry her before the baby was born to make it legitimate. So he secretly married her, even though he was still legally married to Catherine. Talk about messy. In March, Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals, which declared that England was an empire, not subject to any foreign authority. This meant Catherine couldn't appeal to Rome anymore. English courts had the final say, and those courts were controlled by Henry. In May, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, a guy sympathetic to Henry's cause, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid and his marriage to Anne valid. Anne was crowned Queen in a lavish ceremony on June 1st, 1533. She wore a purple velvet robe, a colour traditionally reserved for royalty, and her dark hair flowed loose beneath a crown. The Londoners watching the procession were oddly quiet. They loved Catherine and weren't sure about this new queen. Catherine, now demoted to Princess Dowager, was banished from court. She lived in a series of increasingly damp and uncomfortable houses, separated from her daughter Mary, still insisting until her dying day that she was Henry's true wife. You've got to admire her stubbornness, even if it didn't do her much good. The final break with Rome came in 1534 with the Act of Supremacy, which officially made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. This wasn't about Protestant theology. Henry still considered himself Catholic in most ways. It was about power. Who got to make the final decisions about religion in England? Now it was Henry, not the Pope. Let's pause for a moment and think about what this meant for ordinary people. Imagine you're a farmer in a small village. Your family has been Catholic for as long as anyone can remember. The rhythm of your life is marked by church festivals and saints' days. You can't read, but you know the Latin responses at Mass by heart. The church building at the centre of your village has been there for centuries. And now, suddenly, everything is changing. The priest is saying different words. The saints' images are being removed from the walls. The monastery nearby, where you'd go for help in hard times, is under threat. Change is scary at the best of times, and this was a lot of change all at once. Some people were fine with it, either because they genuinely favoured reform or because, let's be real, most people just want to keep their heads down and not get in trouble. Others were deeply upset. In the north of England, where traditional Catholic practices were especially strong, this led to a major rebellion called the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. Thousands of people marched in protest. Henry promised to address their concerns if they dispersed. They believed him. Big mistake. Once the threat was gone, Henry had the leaders executed. Remember what I said about his temper? Yeah. Meanwhile, back in 1533, Anne Boleyn gave birth, not to the son Henry desperately wanted, but to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry put on a brave face, but he was disappointed. Still, he had the marriage annulled, which meant he could try again, and Anne quickly became pregnant again. Anne's time as queen was rocky from the start. She was intelligent and outspoken, qualities that had attracted Henry during their courtship but became liabilities once they were married. She made enemies at court with her sharp tongue. She quarrelled with Henry over politics and religion, and she struggled with the immense pressure to produce a male heir. In January 1536, two major events occurred. Catherine of Aragon died, and Anne Boleyn miscarried a baby boy. With Catherine gone, Henry could have just divorced Anne and moved on. But by this point, his feelings toward her had soured dramatically. He was already showing interest in one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, a quiet, gentle woman who was basically Anne's opposite in temperament. Cromwell, sensing which way the wind was blowing, moved against Anne. In April 1536, several men of the court, including Anne's own brother George, were arrested and charged with having adulterous relationships with the Queen. The evidence was flimsy at best, but that didn't matter. This was a political move, not a legal one. Anne herself was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same place where she had stayed before her coronation, now transformed into her prison. The walls would have felt the same, cold stone beneath her fingers, but everything else had changed. Instead of preparing for glory, she was awaiting death. The charges against Anne included adultery, incest with her brother, and plotting to kill the king. She denied everything, but the verdict was never in doubt. She was convicted and sentenced to death. Imagine how it would feel to be Anne during those final days. The small, cold room in the tower, the fear and uncertainty, the knowledge that the man who had once written you passionate love letters and turned the country upside down to marry you now wanted you dead. On May 19th, 1536, Anne was beheaded on Tower Green by a skilled executioner brought from France. Henry's one small mercy was ensuring it would be quick. She wore a dark grey dress and a red petticoat, her dark hair tucked up under a simple cap. She maintained her dignity to the end, making a short speech declaring her innocence but acknowledging the king's kindness to her. With Anne barely cold in her unmarked grave, Henry married Jane Seymour on May 30th, 1536. No waiting period, no mourning, just straight on to wife number 3. If you're keeping score at home, we're now at divorced, beheaded, alive. Jane was everything Anne wasn't. Quiet, traditional, submissive. She took as her motto, bound to obey and serve, which pretty much tells you everything you need to know about her approach to being queen. Henry was pleased with her, and she quickly became pregnant. While these dramatic personal events were unfolding, Henry was also implementing the most controversial policy of his reign, the dissolution of the monasteries. Under Cromwell's direction, all the monasteries, priories, convents and friaries in England were shut down between 1536 and 1541. Their lands and wealth were seized by the Crown. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how massive this change was. There were nearly 900 religious houses in England, with around 12,000 monks, nuns and friars. They owned about a quarter of all the land in England. 1 in every 50 adult men was in religious orders. Monasteries had been part of English life for centuries, serving as centres of learning, healthcare, charity and hospitality. Cromwell justified the closures by presenting evidence of corruption and immorality in the monasteries. His inspectors went around the country collecting scandalous stories, monks breaking their vows of chastity, abbots living in luxury while the poor starved, fake relics being used to scam pilgrims. Some of these stories were true, some were exaggerated, and some were completely made up. The real motivation, though, was money. Henry needed cash. The monasteries were rich. It was as simple as that. The smaller monasteries went first in 1536. Their residents were given the choice to transfer to larger houses or take a pension and rejoin secular life. Their buildings, land and treasures were taken by the Crown. The larger monasteries followed between 1538 and 1541. Some abbots who resisted were executed, like the elderly abbot of Glastonbury, who was dragged through the town on a hurdle and then hanged, drawn and quartered on Glastonbury Tor, a gruesome death that would have sent a clear message to anyone else thinking of resisting. The impact on local communities was profound. Monasteries had provided employment, education, healthcare and charity. They had been centres of learning and culture, preserving books and knowledge. Many of their libraries were destroyed, the books used for scrap paper or to polish boots. Magnificent buildings were stripped of anything valuable, lead from the roofs, stone from the walls, gold and silver from the shrines, and left to decay. Some monastery buildings were converted to new uses, parish churches, mansions for the wealthy, or sometimes just quarries for building material. Others were left as romantic ruins that still dot the English countryside today. If you've ever visited places like Fountains Abbey or Tintern Abbey, you've seen the physical remnants of this massive upheaval. The wealth that poured into Henry's coffers was staggering, equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's money. But it didn't last long. Henry spent lavishly on palaces, clothes, and especially on warfare. By the end of his reign, despite all the monastery wealth, he was nearly bankrupt again. One important effect of the dissolution was creating a class of people who had a vested interest in maintaining the break with Rome. Henry sold much of the monastery land to nobles and gentry at bargain prices. These new landowners knew that if England ever returned to Catholicism, they might lose their new possessions, so they became strong supporters of the religious changes, whatever their personal beliefs might be. Now, back to Henry's personal life. In October 1537, Jane Seymour gave Henry the greatest gift she could, a son. The boy was christened Edward, and Henry was ecstatic. Bonfires were lit across London, church bells rang all day, wine flowed freely in the streets as people celebrated the birth of a male heir. But the joy was short-lived. Jane developed childbed fever, a common and often fatal infection after childbirth in an age before antibiotics or proper hygiene. She grew weaker day by day, her body burning with fever, the palace physicians helpless to save her. She died on October 24th, just 12 days after giving birth. Henry was genuinely devastated by Jane's death. She had given him his heart's desire, a legitimate son, and he had grown fond of her gentle personality. He wore black for 3 months and didn't remarry for over 2 years, an unusually long period of mourning for a king who needed to secure the succession with more sons. When Henry eventually decided to marry again, it was for political reasons rather than personal ones. By 1539, England was in danger of being caught between the two major Catholic powers of Europe, France and the Holy Roman Empire, who might join forces to invade and return the country to Catholicism. Henry needed Protestant allies, and Germany seemed like a good option. Thomas Cromwell, still the king's chief minister, suggested a marriage alliance with the Protestant Duchy of Cleves. Arrangements were made for Henry to marry Anne, the Duke's sister. Henry had never met her, but he was shown a flattering portrait painted by Hans Holbein and agreed to the match. When Anne arrived in England in January 1540, Henry rode to Rochester to surprise her with a romantic gesture. He burst into her room in disguise, expecting her to recognise him from descriptions and portraits and fall into his arms. Instead, she had no idea who this large, overdressed stranger was and basically ignored him. Not the best first impression. Henry found Anne physically unappealing. He famously compared her to a Flanders mare, though not to her face, but the political situation was delicate, and the marriage went ahead on January 6, 1540. It was a disaster from the start. Henry claimed the marriage was never consummated, and by July he was already looking for a way out. Conveniently, the political situation had changed, reducing the need for the German alliance. Cromwell, who had arranged the marriage, fell from favour and was executed on trumped-up charges of treason and heresy. Anne of Cleves, unlike Catherine of Aragon, was smart enough to see which way the wind was blowing. She agreed to an annulment, testifying that the marriage had never been consummated. In return, she received a generous settlement, including Hever Castle, ironically Anne Boleyn's childhood home, a decent income, and the title of King's beloved sister. She outlived Henry and all his other wives, living quietly in England until her death in 1557. With Anne of Cleves safely set aside, Henry was free to pursue wife number 5, Catherine Howard. She was young, possibly as young as 16 or 17 when they married, vivacious and pretty. She was also the cousin of Anne Boleyn, which apparently didn't strike Henry as a bad omen. Catherine was a stark contrast to the serious, intellectual Anne Boleyn. She loved dancing, fine clothes and jewellery. Henry was besotted with her youth and high spirits, calling her his rose without a thorn. He showered her with gifts and showed her off proudly. But Catherine had a past that would come back to haunt her. Before coming to court, she had had romantic relationships with at least 2 men. In the double standard of the time, Henry could have as many mistresses as he wanted before and during marriage, but his wives were expected to be paragons of virtue. By 1541, Henry was no longer the athletic young king who had bounded up to the throne. He was 50 years old, overweight, and suffering from a painful ulcerated leg wound that never seemed to heal. The contrast between the aging king and his teenage bride was striking, and not in a good way. As winter sets in, the palace grows colder. Draughts whistle through cracks in the walls despite the tapestries. The smell of wood smoke is constant as fires burn day and night to ward off the chill. Your own eyelids feel heavy as you imagine the warm weight of Tudor blankets pressing you into a feather mattress, the quiet murmur of servants moving about in the darkness beyond your closed eyes. Henry's court settles into an uneasy routine with its new young queen, but rumours begin to circulate, whispers in corners, glances exchanged when the king's back is turned. In the shadowy world of Tudor politics, secrets rarely stay secret for long, and Catherine Howard's past is about to catch up with her. The rhythm of palace life continues. The meals in the Great Hall, the religious services now conducted in English rather than Latin, the endless paperwork of governance, the hunts when weather permits. But beneath the surface, tensions simmer. Religious conservatives and reformers eye each other warily. Those who gained from the monastery dissolutions guard their new wealth jealously. And in the Queen's chambers, a young woman who never expected to be queen tries to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor court politics. Your breath deepens as you sink further into the story, your body growing heavier against the bed. The world of Tudor England, with its smells of herbs and smoke, its sounds of bells and whispers, its feel of rough wool and smooth silk, wraps around you like a cocoon. Sleep tugs at the edges of your consciousness as you wonder what will happen next to the king who rewrote the rules to get what he wanted, only to find that even a king cannot control everything. Your body feels pleasantly heavy now, sinking deeper into your bed as the story of Henry VIII continues to unfold. The flickering candlelight of Tudor England dances behind your closed eyelids, the scent of wood smoke and herbs lingering in your imagination. November 1541. The cold winds of late autumn sweep across England as King Henry VIII, now in his 50th year, receives news that will send his court into turmoil once again. His young wife, Catherine Howard, has been accused of having affairs both before and during their marriage. The king, who had called her his rose without a thorn, discovers that his teenage bride has thorns after all. The evidence against Catherine came from several sources. A former lover, Francis Derham, had boasted about his relationship with her. Another man, Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, had been meeting her in secret with the help of Lady Rochford, who was ironically the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother. When Henry first heard the accusations, he refused to believe them, but as more evidence emerged, he was devastated. This betrayal cut deep. In his mind, he had rescued this young woman from obscurity, made her a queen, showered her with jewels and gowns, and this was how she repaid him. Unlike Anne Boleyn, whose alleged crimes were almost certainly fabricated, Catherine Howard was probably guilty of at least some of the accusations, but that doesn't make her fate any less tragic. She was young, poorly educated, and thrust into a position she was completely unprepared for. The glittering world of court, with its intrigues and temptations, was a dangerous place for someone so naive. Henry's reaction to Catherine's betrayal was volcanic. He swung between rage and self-pity, at one point demanding a sword to kill her himself. When that moment of fury passed, he retreated to his chambers and wept. The court watched nervously, no one quite sure what to say or do. Catherine was confined to her rooms and then sent to Sion Abbey. In February 1542, she was taken to the Tower of London. The night before her execution, she reportedly asked for the block to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head on it. Try to imagine that for a moment. a teenager practicing for her own beheading. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London on the same spot where Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. She was small and had to be helped up onto the scaffold. Her final speech was brief, acknowledging her worthy and just punishment and asking for mercy for her family. The axe fell, and Henry's 5th marriage came to its bloody end. In the wake of Catherine's execution, Henry had Parliament pass a bizarre law making it treason for a queen to fail to disclose her sexual history to the king. He also never spoke her name again, ordering all reminders of her to be removed from his palaces. For almost a year and a half after Catherine Howard's death, Henry remained unmarried, his longest period as a single man since his first marriage. But by 1543, he was looking for wife number 6. His choice fell on Catherine Parr, a twice-widowed noblewoman in her early 30s. Catherine Parr was an interesting woman, intelligent, well-educated, and with strong religious convictions leaning toward the reformist side. She had been planning to marry Thomas Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, when Henry expressed interest in her, and when the king expressed interest, you couldn't exactly say no. Catherine approached marriage to Henry as a duty rather than a love match. By this point, Henry was 52, obese, and suffering from a multitude of health problems. His ulcerated leg caused him constant pain, and the sweet-natured boy who had bounded to the throne had become an unpredictable, often cruel man prone to violent mood swings. Despite these challenges, Catherine proved to be an excellent queen. She managed Henry's household efficiently, created a stable environment for his children, and even reconciled him with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, who were brought back to court and added to the line of succession. Catherine was also the first English queen to publish books under her own name. She wrote religious works that subtly promoted Protestant ideas while being careful not to push too far and anger her volatile husband. She was a patron of the arts and education, particularly for women. The court during these later years of Henry's reign was a very different place from the glittering youthful court of his early days. The king's mobility was limited by his leg and his weight. The carefree jousting and dancing had given way to more sedate entertainments. Religious tensions simmered beneath the surface, with conservatives and reformers vying for influence. Imagine yourself at court during this time. The great halls would still be impressive, hung with tapestries and lit by candles, but there would be a heaviness in the air. Courtiers would watch the king anxiously, trying to gauge his mood, never sure if a casual remark might trigger his temper. The smell of medicinal herbs and ointments would mingle with the usual court scents as doctors tried to treat the king's increasingly troublesome leg. While Catherine Parr managed the domestic side of things, Henry's government was run largely by factions. The Conservative faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, favoured traditional Catholic practices. The Reformist faction, which included Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and Edward Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, pushed for more Protestant reforms. In 1546, the Conservative faction briefly gained the upper hand and tried to bring down Catherine Parr. They persuaded Henry that her religious views were too radical, and he signed a warrant for her arrest. But Catherine was warned in time and managed to convince Henry that she only discussed theology with him to distract him from his painful leg and to learn from his superior wisdom. Henry reconciled with her and instead turned on her accusers, berating them in front of her. It was a close call for Catherine, demonstrating just how dangerous it was to be close to Henry, even as his wife. The episode also showed how skilled she was at managing him, something few people ever mastered. Outside the royal court, life for ordinary people continued much as it had for centuries, though with some significant changes. The Reformation had altered religious practices. Services were now in English rather than Latin, making them more accessible. Many traditional celebrations associated with Catholic saints' days were discouraged or banned. The parish churches had been stripped of images, wall paintings whitewashed, and elaborate decorations removed in favour of simpler, more austere spaces. The dissolution of the monasteries had disrupted traditional patterns of charity and healthcare. Before, if you were sick or destitute, you might seek help at a nearby monastery. Now, with those institutions gone, responsibility for the poor fell more heavily on parish communities. A series of poor laws began to develop, establishing a system for parishes to collect funds to support those in need. Economically, the mid-Tudor period was challenging for many. A growing population put pressure on food supplies, leading to rising prices. The enclosure of common land for sheep farming displaced many agricultural workers. Periodic bad harvests caused hardship and sometimes famine. Wages failed to keep pace with inflation, meaning most working people were becoming poorer in real terms. Yet there were opportunities too, especially for the growing middle classes of merchants, lawyers and skilled craftsmen. Trade was expanding, both within England and internationally. London was becoming one of Europe's major cities, with a population approaching 100,000 by the end of Henry's reign. Education was becoming more valued, with grammar schools established in many towns, often using buildings or funds from the dissolved monasteries. Literacy was increasing, particularly among the urban middle classes. The printing press was making books more widely available, though they remained expensive luxury items for most people. For women, life remained constrained by social expectations and legal limitations. A woman was expected to be under male authority, her father's until she married, then her husband's. Women couldn't vote, hold office, or, with rare exceptions, own property independently. Their education, if they received any, focused on skills needed to run a household and be a good wife and mother. Yet there were women who found ways to exercise influence and agency within these constraints. Noble women might manage large estates while their husbands were away. Widows often ran businesses left by their husbands. And the religious debates of the Reformation actually created spaces where women's voices could sometimes be heard, as Catherine Parr's published works demonstrated. Meanwhile, Henry's health was deteriorating rapidly. His leg caused him constant agony. He had become so obese that mechanical devices were needed to move him between floors in his palaces. Some accounts suggest he eventually reached a waist measurement of 54 inches. His temper, never good, became even more unpredictable. Despite his physical decline, Henry remained active in state affairs, particularly foreign policy. In 1542, he went to war with Scotland again, defeating the Scots at the Battle of Solway Moss. In 1543, he allied with Emperor Charles V against France, and in 1544, he personally went to France, for the last time, to oversee the capture of Boulogne. These wars were expensive and largely pointless. They drained the treasury that had been filled by the monastery wealth and left Henry nearly bankrupt by the end of his reign, but they satisfied his desire to be seen as a warrior king like the hero King Henry V, whom he had idolised since childhood. As his health worsened, Henry became increasingly concerned about what would happen after his death. His son Edward was a bright, precocious child, but still only 9 years old in 1546. Henry knew that a child king would mean a regency, which could easily lead to power struggles and instability. To try to prevent this, Henry established a council of 16 men who were to govern collectively during Edward's minority. He probably hoped that by balancing different factions, he could prevent any one group from seizing control. It didn't work out that way, but that's a story for another time. In December 1546, Henry made his final public appearance, addressing Parliament. By January 1547, he was confined to his bed at Whitehall Palace. The end was clearly near, but courtiers were afraid to mention death to the king. A 1542 law had made it treason to predict the king's death. So no one dared raise the subject of his will or funeral arrangements until the very end. Henry died in the early hours of January 28, 1547. Catherine Parr was at his side, along with Archbishop Cranmer. Henry was 55 years old and had reigned for almost 38 years. In his final hours, he asked for Cranmer, but by the time the Archbishop arrived, the king could no longer speak. He squeezed Cranmer's hand in response to a question about whether he placed his trust in Christ, and shortly afterward, he died. The king's death was kept secret for 3 days while the council made arrangements for the transition of power. Edward Seymour, the young king's uncle, quickly outmanoeuvred the other councillors to become Lord Protector, effectively ruling in Edward's name. Henry was buried at Windsor Castle in St George's Chapel next to Jane Seymour, the only one of his wives to receive a queen's funeral and the only one buried with him. His elaborate tomb was never completed, the money ran out, and the bronze sculptures intended for it were later sold off. So what sort of legacy did Henry VIII leave? It's complicated. He'd transformed England from a Catholic country to a Protestant one, though the exact nature of that Protestantism remained contested. He'd strengthened the power of the monarchy, making the king not just a political leader, but a religious one too. He'd redistributed a huge amount of land and wealth from the church to the nobility and gentry, creating a class of landowners with a vested interest in the new religious settlement. But he'd also left the country nearly bankrupt, embroiled in expensive foreign wars, and with a child as king. The religious changes he'd set in motion were still controversial, with many people either thinking they hadn't gone far enough or gone too far, and his habit of executing those who crossed him had created a political culture of fear and instability. Henry's personal legacy was equally mixed. He'd finally secured the male heir he so desperately wanted, but Edward was a sickly child. He also left 2 daughters whose status had been complicated by his multiple marriages and divorces. The Tudor dynasty he'd worked so hard to secure would actually end with his children, none of whom had heirs of their own. For all his power and bluster, there's something almost tragic about Henry VIII. He began his reign as the Golden Prince, handsome and athletic, brimming with Renaissance ideals. He ended it as a bloated, pain-racked tyrant, feared rather than loved. Somewhere along the way, the promising young king had transformed into a monster. Yet even as a monster, Henry remains fascinating, perhaps because his emotional life seems so accessible to us. His desires, his fears, his rages, and occasional moments of tenderness are all vividly documented, or perhaps because his reign sits at this pivotal moment in history when medieval certainties were giving way to modern complexities. Let's take a step back from the grand sweep of history and imagine a more intimate scene from Henry's later years. Picture a winter evening at Hampton Court Palace, which Henry had seized from Cardinal Wolsey and expanded into one of his favourite residences. The palace is a marvel of Tudor architecture, with its great hall, chapel, and sprawling kitchens that could feed 600 people twice a day. The king sits by a roaring fire, his swollen leg propped up on a stool, wrapped in bandages soaked with herbal remedies that do little to ease his pain. The room is warm, almost stifling, because Henry feels the cold keenly now that his health is failing. Tapestries cover the walls, their threaded scenes depicting hunts and battles from better days. Catherine Parr sits nearby, perhaps reading aloud from one of her own religious works or from the English Bible that is no longer a forbidden text. She has a calm, steady presence that soothes the king's volatile temper. Perhaps young Elizabeth is there too, her red hair and clever eyes reminiscent of her mother, though no one would dare mention Anne Boleyn in Henry's presence. Servants move quietly around the edges of the room, bringing food, stoking the fire, adjusting cushions. They've learned to be nearly invisible, to anticipate needs without being asked, to avoid drawing attention. One wrong word, one spilled cup could trigger the king's rage. Outside, the winter night presses against the glass windows, another luxury that only the wealthy can afford. Most homes still use oiled paper or shutters to keep out the elements. The Thames might be frozen, as it sometimes did in particularly cold winters, or flowing darkly past the palace's rivergate, where barges would dock, bringing visitors and supplies. In London, a few miles away, the city settles into its nighttime rhythm. Apprentices and servants are locked inside their masters' houses for the night. The city gates are closed. Watchmen patrol the streets, calling out the hours and watching for fires, which are a constant danger in a city built largely of wood. In taverns and alehouses, those with permission to be out after curfew drink and talk, perhaps discussing the latest religious changes or the price of bread or the king's health, though the latter topic would be approached cautiously. Throughout England, similar scenes play out at different scales. In great houses and small cottages, people gather around fires for warmth and light. They talk, they work on small crafts that can be done by firelight. They tell stories, they pray, though exactly how they pray has changed during Henry's reign and will continue to change in the years ahead. This is the England that Henry will soon leave behind, a country transformed by his desires and decisions for better and worse, a country where ancient monasteries stand roofless and ruined while new mansions rise for those who benefited from their fall, where church services are conducted in English rather than Latin, and the Pope's authority has been replaced by the King's, where the old certainties have been shaken but new ones haven't yet fully formed. The fire crackles and sends up sparks, its heat making your eyelids even heavier. The weight of history presses gently on your consciousness, and the rhythms of the Tudor world, the toll of church bells marking the hours, the measured pace of ceremonial court life, the seasonal cycles of planting and harvest that continued regardless of political upheavals, lull you deeper towards sleep. Your body feels deliciously heavy now, sinking into your mattress like a small boat settling into still water. The tensions of your day release one by one as you float on the currents of Henry's turbulent reign. The king's story continues to unfold behind your closed eyes, but your breathing has slowed, matching the steady rhythm of sleep approaching. Each breath is deeper than the last, carrying you further from wakefulness, wrapping you in a cocoon of historical dreams. Your mind drifts along the currents of Tudor history, your body pleasantly heavy and warm. The flickering candlelight of Hampton Court Palace still plays behind your closed eyelids as we turn to what happened after Henry VIII left this world. The king is dead. His body, swollen and ailing in his final years, lies in state while a child prepares to take his place. What becomes of a kingdom when such a dominating figure is suddenly gone? When Henry died in January 1547, his 9-year-old son Edward became King Edward VI. The boy had been raised for this role, educated by the finest tutors trained in languages, theology and statecraft, but he was still a child, and real power fell to his uncle, Edward Seymour, who took the title Lord Protector and effectively ruled England. Imagine little Edward, a solemn, pale boy with reddish hair, suddenly thrust into the centre of court ceremony, the crown so heavy on his small head, the robes dragging on the floor, everyone bowing and scraping before him while subtly manipulating him behind the scenes. It couldn't have been an easy life. Under Edward's reign, or more accurately, under the regency of his uncle, England moved more decisively toward Protestantism. The English prayer book replaced the Latin Mass. Church decoration was further simplified. Religious images were destroyed. Priests were allowed to marry. The changes that had begun under Henry for largely personal and political reasons were now being driven by genuine religious conviction. Not everyone was happy with these changes. In Devon and Cornwall, a major rebellion broke out in 1549 as people demanded the return of the old religious practices. It was brutally suppressed, with thousands killed. The Tudor state, like its founder, had little tolerance for opposition. Meanwhile, what happened to Catherine Parr, Henry's surviving wife? After a suitable period of mourning, she did what she had wanted to do before Henry proposed. She married Thomas Seymour, brother of the Lord Protector. It was a love match, and initially they seemed happy. They took in the young Princess Elizabeth, now a teenager, to live with them. But things soon got weird. Thomas Seymour began making inappropriate advances toward Elizabeth, entering her bedroom half-dressed, slapping her on the backside, trying to kiss her. Catherine was pregnant and either didn't notice or chose to ignore it at first. When she did catch them embracing, she sent Elizabeth away, blaming the girl rather than her husband. Catherine gave birth to a daughter in August 1548, but died a few days later of childbed fever, just like Jane Seymour before her. Thomas Seymour's behaviour became increasingly erratic after her death. He was eventually executed for plotting to overthrow his brother and marry Princess Elizabeth. Elizabeth herself had a narrow escape. She was questioned about her relationship with Seymour, but handled herself with remarkable poise for a teenager, revealing nothing that could be used against her. It was an early lesson in political survival that would serve her well in the dangerous years ahead. As for Edward, the boy king's reign was brief. He had never been a robust child, and in 1553, at age 15, he fell ill with what was probably tuberculosis. As he lay dying, a power struggle erupted over who would succeed him. Edward, raised as a staunch Protestant, was determined that his Catholic half-sister Mary should not inherit the throne. With the support of the powerful Duke of Northumberland, who had replaced Edward Seymour as the real power behind the throne, Edward signed a device for the succession that bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Lady Jane Grey, a distant cousin who was conveniently married to Northumberland's son. When Edward died in July 1553, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen, but her reign lasted just 9 days. Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, rallied support and marched on London. The Privy Council, seeing which way the wind was blowing, abandoned Jane and proclaimed Mary the rightful Queen. Lady Jane Grey, just 16 or 17 years old, was imprisoned in the Tower along with her husband. They were eventually executed the following year when their continued existence became a focus for Protestant opposition to Mary's rule. Mary VIII, now Queen of England, was determined to return the country to Catholicism. She restored the old religious practices, welcomed papal authority back, and married her cousin Philip II of Spain, a staunch Catholic. None of these moves were popular with the English people, who had by now absorbed many Protestant ideas and were suspicious of Spanish influence. When resistance to her religious changes emerged, Mary responded with persecution. During her 5-year reign, around 300 Protestants were burned at the stake for heresy, earning her the later nickname Bloody Mary. Among those executed were Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had played such a key role in Henry VIII's break with Rome. Imagine what it must have been like for Mary to finally gain the throne after years of mistreatment. Her mother had been cast aside, her own status downgraded from princess to illegitimate daughter. She had been separated from her mother, forced to serve in her half-sister Elizabeth's household, pressured to accept religious changes she considered heretical. Now, at last, she had the power to set things right as she saw them. But Mary's reign was troubled by more than religious conflicts. She desperately wanted a child to secure the Catholic succession, and twice she believed herself pregnant, only to be disappointed. The second pregnancy was probably a growing tumour, as she was likely suffering from ovarian or uterine cancer. She died in November 1558 at age 42, with her Spanish husband absent and her Catholic restoration incomplete. The crown passed to Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, by Anne Boleyn. At 25, Elizabeth had survived a dangerous and uncertain childhood and adolescence to become one of England's greatest monarchs, but that's a story for another night. Let's step back from the royal succession and think about how ordinary people experienced the tumultuous years after Henry's death, the religious changes that swept back and forth, Protestant under Edward, Catholic under Mary, and eventually a moderate Protestantism under Elizabeth, affected daily life in countless ways. Imagine you're a typical English farmer in a small village. Within the space of a dozen years, the services at your parish church change completely. Multiple times, the paintings on the walls are whitewashed, then perhaps restored, then whitewashed again. The familiar Latin gives way to English, then back to Latin, then to English again. The priest celebrates communion one way, then another. He's unmarried, then allowed to marry, then required to set aside his wife, then allowed to marry again. Is it any wonder that many people became confused or cynical about religion? A common joke at the time was about the Vicar of Bray, a fictional priest who changed his religious views with each monarch, declaring, "I am resolved to live and die the Vicar of Bray, sir." When asked how he could reconcile his conscience with such shifting beliefs, he replied that his principle was to live and die the Vicar of Bray, whatever it took to keep his comfortable position. Beyond the religious turmoil, economic conditions continued to be difficult in the mid-16th century. A growing population put pressure on food supplies. A series of poor harvests in the 1550s led to hunger and hardship. Prices rose while wages stagnated, making most working people poorer in real terms. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry had disrupted traditional patterns of charity and healthcare. Now the responsibility for the poor fell more heavily on parish communities. The government began to develop more systematic approaches to poverty, distinguishing between the deserving poor, the elderly, orphans, the disabled, who deserved support, and the undeserving poor, the able-bodied who refused to work, who faced punishment. London continued to grow rapidly, reaching a population of around 120,000 by the end of the century. It was a city of contrasts, grand mansions alongside overcrowded tenements, wealthy merchants alongside desperate beggars. The smell would have hit you immediately. A mixture of coal smoke, raw sewage dumped directly into the Thames, rotting food and unwashed bodies. The noise would have been constant, street vendors crying their wares, cartwheels on cobblestones, church bells, animals, arguments, laughter. Outside London, about 90% of the population lived in rural areas. Most were tenant farmers or agricultural labourers whose lives followed the rhythm of the seasons. Spring meant ploughing and planting, summer was for tending crops and haymaking, autumn brought the all-important harvest, and winter was for repairs, indoor crafts, and hoping the food would last until spring. The typical rural home was still quite simple, a timber frame filled in with wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks, straw, clay and dung, with a thatched roof. There might be 2 or 3 rooms at most, with the main room centred around the hearth. The smoke from the fire would escape through a hole in the roof or through the thatch itself, as chimneys were still a relative luxury. The floor would be packed earth, perhaps strewn with rushes or straw for warmth. Furniture was minimal. A table, benches, perhaps a chest for storage, and beds for the family. These weren't like our mattresses today. Tudor beds were wooden frames with ropes strung across to support a mattress stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers if you were wealthy. People often slept semi-upright as they believed lying flat was unhealthy. Light came from the fire and perhaps a few rushlights, rushes dipped in animal fat, or tallow candles if you could afford them. Beeswax candles gave the best light but were expensive. Most people simply followed the natural rhythm of daylight, going to bed soon after sunset and rising at dawn. Food for ordinary people was simple, but filling when available. The daily diet centred on bread, dark, coarse bread for the poor, finer white bread for the wealthy. Pottage, a thick soup or stew of vegetables and perhaps a little meat was a staple. Cheese, eggs, and seasonal fruits and vegetables rounded out the diet. Meat was relatively rare for the poor, except perhaps bacon from the family pig. Beer was the standard drink, consumed by everyone including children, as it was safer than water. Clothes were made to last, often passed down through family members and repeatedly patched. Wool was the main fabric, in natural colours or dyed with plant-based dyes. Linen was used for undergarments. Leather was crucial for shoes, belts, and many working tools. Everything was handmade, often at home or within the local community. Life expectancy remained short by our standards, perhaps 35-40 years on average, though this was skewed by high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you might well live into your 60s or even 70s, but aging brought its own challenges. Without glasses, many people became functionally blind as their vision deteriorated. Without dentistry, toothaches and lost teeth made eating painful and difficult. Without effective pain relief, chronic conditions like arthritis could be debilitating. Yet for all these hardships, Tudor life had its pleasures too. Alehouses provided gathering places for conversation and community. Village festivals marked the turning of the seasons and religious holidays. Music, dancing, and storytelling were universal entertainments that cost nothing. Games and sports, from simple dice and board games to elaborate hunts and tournaments for the wealthy, offered diversion from daily toil. The Tudor world was, in many ways, more colourful and sensuous than we might imagine. Yes, there was dirt and disease, but there was also pageantry and pleasure. The great halls of noble houses would be hung with bright tapestries, the tables set with pewter or even silver. Feasts would feature elaborate subtleties, decorative food sculptures that might depict castles, ships, or mythological scenes. Even peasant celebrations had their own vivid traditions: the May Day dances, the harvest home festivals, the Christmas mumming plays. And throughout this world, the legacy of Henry VIII was felt in countless ways. The redistribution of monastery lands had created a new class of wealthy landowners. The break with Rome had set England on a separate religious path that would continue to evolve through the reigns of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. The strengthened monarchy that Henry had created would reach its peak under Elizabeth before facing challenges under the Stuarts in the next century. Perhaps most importantly, Henry had established the principle that the monarch had authority over the church as well as the state. This fusion of religious and political power shaped English identity for centuries to come. It's why England never experienced the kind of religious wars that devastated parts of continental Europe, but also why religious conformity was enforced by the state, sometimes brutally. In a very real sense, modern England was born in the tumultuous years of Henry's reign. The medieval world, with its universal Catholic Church and feudal relationships, gave way to something recognisably closer to our own world, a nation-state with its own distinct religious identity, a growing middle class, and an increasingly centralised government. Yet Henry himself remains an enigma. Was he the glittering Renaissance prince of his early years, or the bloated tyrant of his later reign? Was he driven by principle, or merely by desire? Was he a monster, or simply a man of his time who happened to wield enormous power? Perhaps he was all of these things. Human beings are complex, contradictory creatures, and Henry was nothing if not intensely human. His desires, fears, rages, and occasional moments of tenderness are all recognizable to us across the centuries. As the Tudor world recedes further into the mists of your imagination, your body feels increasingly heavy and relaxed. The weight of history presses you gently into your mattress. The rhythmic toll of church bells marking the hours fades to a distant echo. The flickering candlelight that illuminated the Tudor scenes grows dimmer, the shadows deeper and more velvety. The scents of wood smoke and herbs blend into a single soothing aroma that fills your mind as your breathing slows and deepens. Your muscles release their tension one by one from your toes to your shoulders. The royal intrigue, the religious conflicts, the daily struggles of ordinary people all drift further away as sleep approaches like a gentle tide. Henry VIII, that larger-than-life king who bent a nation to his will, becomes a shadow figure in your mind's eye. His booming voice fades to a whisper. The weight of his presence lightens. The story continues, but you are floating now, suspended in that peaceful space between wakefulness and dreams. The Tudor world, with all its vivid contrasts, splendour and squalor, cruelty and kindness, tradition and innovation, dissolves into soft darkness. Your breathing finds a slow, steady rhythm. Your thoughts become more fragmentary, less distinct. The pressure of your body against the bed becomes the only sensation you're aware of as sleep draws nearer with each breath. Behind your closed eyelids, the last image of Henry fades. Not the fearsome tyrant, but the young king, full of promise, riding through London to his coronation, the future still unwritten, possibilities still endless. And as this image dissolves, you drift deeper into the welcoming embrace of sleep, the Tudor world transformed into dreams. The gentle waves of sleep lap at the edges of your consciousness as we reach the final chapter of our journey through Tudor England. Your body feels wonderfully heavy, your breathing slow and deep as we explore the lasting legacy of Henry VIII through the golden age that followed his tumultuous reign. When Mary died in November 1558, the crown passed to Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, by Anne Boleyn, the girl whose mother had been executed, whose status had fluctuated between princess and illegitimate daughter, whose life had been threatened more than once, now found herself Queen of England at age 25. Elizabeth's accession marked the beginning of one of the most celebrated reigns in English history. She inherited a country divided by religion, threatened by powerful foreign enemies, and facing economic challenges. By the time of her death, 44 years later, England had become a major European power with a flourishing culture that gave us Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser. The transformation of England under Elizabeth was, in many ways, the fulfilment of potential created during Henry's reign. The religious settlement she established, a moderate Protestantism that retained some Catholic traditions, built on her father's break with Rome. The naval power that defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588 had its roots in Henry's expansion of the royal fleet. The flowering of literature and drama during her reign grew from seeds planted in Henry's Renaissance court. Elizabeth was very much her father's daughter, intelligent, charismatic, strong-willed and skilled at projecting royal authority, but she was also wiser than Henry in many ways. Where he acted on impulse, she deliberated carefully. Where he spent lavishly, she was frugal. Where he married 6 times, she remained single, styling herself as married to her country. Elizabeth understood something fundamental about power that her father never fully grasped. Sometimes the most effective use of authority is the threat rather than the execution. Henry executed dozens of prominent nobles and officials. Elizabeth executed far fewer, though she wasn't afraid to do so when necessary, as the unfortunate Mary, Queen of Scots, discovered. Imagine Elizabeth with her flame-red hair and pale complexion, so like her father in her younger years, processing through London streets lined with cheering crowds. Her gowns would be magnificent creations of silk, velvet and cloth of gold, stiff with jewels and embroidery. But beneath the splendid exterior was a shrewd political mind that carefully calculated every public appearance for maximum effect. Like her father, Elizabeth understood the power of image. But where Henry projected strength through physical presence and displays of wealth, Elizabeth created a more complex persona: the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the fairy queen of Spenser's poetry, simultaneously mother and bride to the nation. It was a brilliant piece of political theatre that transformed a potential weakness, her unmarried status, into a source of power. Under Elizabeth, England's position in the world changed dramatically. When Henry died, England was still a second-rate power compared to Spain or France. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, English ships were circumnavigating the globe, beginning to establish colonies in the New World and challenging Spanish dominance of the seas. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was the symbolic moment when England emerged as a major naval power. Philip II of Spain, who had briefly been England's king during his marriage to Mary I, sent a massive fleet to invade England and restore Catholicism. The English fleet, smaller but more manoeuvrable, harried the Spanish ships up the Channel. A combination of English fireships, stormy weather, and Spanish tactical errors resulted in a decisive English victory. This naval tradition that began under Henry and flowered under Elizabeth would eventually lead to the British Empire, the largest in world history. The small island nation that Henry had ruled would, in time, control territories across the globe, spreading English language, law, and customs worldwide. That imperial legacy, both positive and negative, can be traced back to the Tudor period. Culturally, Elizabeth's reign represented the high point of the English Renaissance. Shakespeare's plays, performed at the Globe Theatre in London, explored the full range of human experience with unprecedented psychological depth. Poets like Edmund Spenser, Philip Sidney and Walter Raleigh created works that still resonate today. Musicians like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis composed church music of haunting beauty that navigated the complex religious landscape of post-Reformation England. This cultural flowering had its roots in Henry's reign. Henry himself was a composer and musician who brought Renaissance influences to the English court. His break with Rome, while primarily political rather than intellectual, created space for new ideas to circulate. The religious debate sparked by the Reformation encouraged literacy and critical thinking. Even the dissolution of the monasteries, for all its destruction, had some positive cultural effects. Monastery libraries were dispersed, making books more widely available. Former monastery buildings were repurposed as schools and colleges. A new class of wealthy landowners became patrons of the arts and learning. One of the most significant but often overlooked aspects of the Tudor period was the growth of the English language. When Henry VIII was born, English was still recovering from its post-Norman conquest decline, when French and Latin dominated official and literary usage. By Elizabeth's death, English had developed into a supremely flexible and expressive literary language capable of producing works like Shakespeare's plays and the King James Bible, completed a few years after Elizabeth's death. Henry contributed to this linguistic flourishing by promoting the use of English in church services and legal proceedings. The first complete English Bible to be approved for public use was published during his reign in 1539. Known as the Great Bible, it was ordered to be placed in every parish church in England, making scripture directly accessible to ordinary people for the first time. The religious changes under Henry also led indirectly to the richness of Elizabethan English. The theological debates of the Reformation required nuanced expression of complex ideas, stretching the language in new directions. The need to communicate religious concepts directly to the people, rather than through Latin-speaking priests, encouraged clarity and vividness in language. Another area where Henry's influence continued long after his death was in government and law. He had strengthened the power of the monarchy, making the king not just the highest political authority, but the head of the church as well. This concentration of power would eventually provoke a reaction under the Stuart kings, leading to the English Civil War and the development of constitutional monarchy. Henry's reign also saw the increased use of Parliament, not because he believed in democracy, but because he needed parliamentary approval for his most controversial actions, such as the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries. By involving Parliament in these decisions, he inadvertently strengthened its position in English governance. The legal system was transformed during the Tudor period with the development of equity law alongside common law, the growth of the Court of Star Chamber to handle cases involving powerful defendants, and the increased professionalisation of the legal profession. These changes laid the groundwork for the modern Anglo-American legal system. Yet for all these grand historical developments, what continues to fascinate us about Henry VIII is the man himself, his personality, his relationships, his inner life. What was he really like, beyond the iconic image of the broad-shouldered king in his famous wide-legged stance, hands on hips glaring out from Holbein's portrait? Henry was a mass of contradictions. He could be charming and cruel, generous and vindictive, cultured and crude. He loved intellectual debate, but brooked no opposition to his will. He wrote love poetry, but ordered the execution of 2 wives. He was deeply religious, yet dissolved the monasteries that had been centres of devotion for centuries. His emotional life was equally complex. He seems to have genuinely loved Catherine of Aragon for many years before turning against her. His pursuit of Anne Boleyn showed obsessive passion, yet he discarded her with cold calculation when she failed to give him a son. He mourned Jane Seymour sincerely, perhaps because she fulfilled her primary duty by providing a male heir before conveniently dying, thus becoming the perfect wife in his eyes, fertile and undemanding. Henry's later marriages reveal a man increasingly trapped in patterns of his own making. Catherine Howard, young enough to be his daughter, briefly rekindled his sense of youth and virility before her betrayal wounded his pride. Catherine Parr provided the companion and nurse he needed in his declining years, a return to the pattern of his first marriage, but with the power dynamic firmly in his favour. Throughout his life, Henry showed a remarkable capacity for self-deception. He convinced himself that his first marriage was sinful, that Anne Boleyn was guilty of adultery, that he was acting as God's agent in reforming the church. This ability to believe his own narrative, regardless of evidence to the contrary, was perhaps his most dangerous quality as a ruler. Yet, for all his flaws, Henry was not the one-dimensional tyrant of popular imagination. He was capable of kindness and loyalty, particularly earlier in his reign. He was a loving father to his children when they didn't cross him. He valued talent and intelligence, promoting men like Thomas Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell based on ability rather than birth. Henry was also a genuine Renaissance man in terms of his interests and accomplishments. He spoke several languages, wrote music and poetry, engaged in theological debates, and took a keen interest in architecture, art, and scientific developments. He built up an impressive library and patronized humanist scholars like Erasmus and Thomas More before executing the latter for opposing his break with Rome. His athletic abilities in his youth were legendary. He excelled at jousting, tennis, hunting, and archery. He was a skilled dancer despite his height, unusual for the time at over 6 feet tall. These physical gifts made his later decline into obesity and illness all the more poignant. The virile young king became a bloated, pain-racked old man who had to be winched onto his horse. Henry's health has been the subject of much speculation. His personality seems to have darkened after a serious jousting accident in 1536, suggesting possible brain damage. His ulcerated leg, which caused him constant pain in later years, may have resulted from an earlier jousting injury becoming infected. Some historians have suggested he suffered from type 2 diabetes, which would explain his increasing weight and declining health. Others have proposed various endocrine disorders or genetic conditions. Whatever the medical explanation, the contrast between the Golden Prince of 1509 and the tyrannical invalid of 1547 is stark. Physical pain and the fear of mortality seem to have exacerbated Henry's worst qualities: his suspicion, his temper, his self-centeredness. Yet even as his body failed him, Henry maintained the essential quality that had defined his reign from the beginning: his absolute conviction of his own rightness. Whether establishing himself as supreme head of the church, declaring a marriage invalid, or ordering an execution, Henry never seems to have experienced significant self-doubt. He created his own reality and expected everyone else to live in it, or die if they refused. This quality made him a terrible husband, a dangerous friend, and a formidable king. It allowed him to make changes that more reflective rulers might have hesitated over: the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the establishment of royal supremacy over the church. All required a ruler convinced of his own authority and willing to face the consequences. Those consequences echoed long after Henry's death. The religious divisions he created led to persecution under both his Catholic daughter Mary and his Protestant daughter Elizabeth, though the latter was more pragmatic about enforcing conformity. The tensions between Catholicism and Protestantism would continue to shape English politics for centuries, contributing to the English Civil War in the 1640s and remaining a factor in British politics into modern times, particularly in Northern Ireland. The vast transfer of wealth and land from the church to the nobility and gentry created a new social and economic order. Former monastery lands were enclosed for sheep farming, accelerating the decline of the feudal open field system and displacing many agricultural workers. The new landowners became a powerful political force with a vested interest in maintaining the religious settlement that had enriched them. Intellectually, the break with Rome opened space for more radical religious ideas to circulate, though Henry himself remained conservative in his theology, maintaining most Catholic doctrines while rejecting papal authority. The door had been opened to more thoroughgoing reform. Under Edward VI, Protestant reforms went much further, and though Mary attempted to reverse them, Elizabeth's settlement established a distinctly English form of Protestantism that combined some Catholic traditions with Protestant theology. This distinctive religious identity contributed to a growing sense of English exceptionalism, the idea that England had a special destiny separate from continental Europe. This national myth would find expression in works like Fox's Book of Martyrs, which portrayed the English Reformation as a heroic struggle against foreign tyranny, and would eventually fuel the imperial expansion of later centuries. In a very real sense, then, modern England, and by extension the English-speaking world, was shaped by Henry VIII's reign. His decisions, driven by a complex mix of political calculation, personal desire, and genuine conviction, set England on a path that diverged from continental Europe in significant ways. The constitutional monarchy, the established church, the common law tradition, the global outlook, all have roots in the Tudor period and specifically in Henry's reign. Yet for all his historical importance, Henry remains enigmatic. The inner man is elusive, hidden behind the carefully constructed royal image and the contradictory accounts of contemporaries. Perhaps that's why he continues to fascinate us 5 centuries later. This larger-than-life figure whose desires reshaped a nation, whose marriages are remembered in childhood rhymes, whose image is instantly recognizable but whose soul remains a mystery. As your mind drifts through these final thoughts about Henry VIII, your body feels increasingly distant, as if you're floating gently above your bed. The weight of history recedes, replaced by the weightlessness of approaching sleep. The Tudor world, with its vivid colours, its strong smells, its hierarchies and certainties, dissolves into the soft darkness behind your eyelids. The rhythm of your breathing has slowed to match the steady, unhurried pace of Tudor life. The turning of the seasons, the tolling of church bells marking the hours, the measured ceremonial steps of court processions. Each breath carries you deeper into that peaceful state between wakefulness and dreams. Henry VIII himself, that towering figure who dominated his age through sheer force of will, becomes smaller, less threatening, more human. The king whose temperamental shifts once determined life and death for those around him has no power here in your quiet room, in this gentle darkness. His story continues to echo through history, but for you, right now, it simply provides a soothing background to your journey towards sleep. Your muscles have completely released their tension. Your body feels deliciously heavy, yet somehow weightless at the same time. The only sensation you're aware of is the soft pressure of your bed supporting you, like a ship carrying you across the calm waters of near sleep. In this peaceful state, perhaps you can find a connection to those long-ago people whose lives were so different from our own, yet who experienced the same fundamental human emotions: love, fear, hope, disappointment, joy. They slept as you are about to sleep, dreamed as you will soon dream, woke to face another day just as you will eventually wake to face yours. But that moment of waking lies far ahead. For now, there is only this quiet darkness, this gentle drifting, this release of thought and tension. The Tudor world has served its purpose, carrying you to the threshold of sleep with its vivid scenes and complicated characters. Now it fades to a distant murmur, a barely perceptible whisper at the edges of consciousness. Your breathing finds its deepest, most restful rhythm. Your thoughts become fragments, disconnected images, brief impressions that dissolve as soon as they form. The last awareness of your physical self, the weight of your body against the bed, begins to blur into nothingness. And as Henry VIII and his Tudor world recede into the mists of history and imagination, you surrender completely to the embrace of sleep, floating free in that timeless space where past and present, history and dreams blend into a single peaceful darkness. Good night.